Good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tim Huxley, the Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Asia. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Fullerton lecture event in the ballroom of the historic Fullerton Hotel in the heart of Singapore's business district. We have with us this morning approximately 200 guests drawn from a broad spectrum of Singapore's society and community, including the business, media, governmental, diplomatic, intellectual, and educational communities. We organize around 6 IISS Fullerton lectures every year. Previous speakers have included the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, then President Calderon of Mexico, and cabinet ministers from Australia, Germany, India, the Philippines, and other countries. I'm delighted that this morning's IISS Fullerton lecture takes the form of a conversation with Mr. K. Shanmugam, Singapore's Minister for Foreign Affairs and also Minister for Law. It's a privilege for us to have with us this morning a senior member of Singapore's government. And I'm very grateful to you, Minister, for making the time in your very hectic schedule to join us this morning for this conversation. By way of introduction, I should say that Mr. Shanmugam was educated at Raffles Institution and at the National University of Singapore, where he graduated top of his class with first-class honors in 1984. He was admitted to the Singapore Bar in 1985, and had a highly successful practice as senior partner and head of litigation and dispute resolution at the local law firm Allen and Gledhill. He was widely recognized as one of the leading litigation, arbitration, and insolvency counsels in Asia. In 1998, he became one of the youngest ever lawyers to be appointed senior counsel of the Supreme Court of Singapore. Mr. Shanmugam was elected as an MP in 1988 as a member of the Sembawang GRC. In 2008, he joined the cabinet as Minister for Law and concurrently as Second Minister for Home Affairs. He assumed the role of Minister for Home Affairs in 2010. After the 2011 general election, Mr. Shanmugam gave up his Home Affairs portfolio and became Minister for Foreign Affairs while continuing to serve as Minister for Law. He is now an MP in the Asean GRC. Given the scope of our remit in the International Institute for Strategic Studies, I suppose it's natural that our primary interest in Mr. Shanmugam's role is in his capacity as Minister for Foreign Affairs. But his long-standing role as Minister for Law is at least equally as important, and I wouldn't be surprised if some in our audience this morning might like to discuss with Mr. Shanmugam matters related to the law in Singapore's domestic context. I'd like to organize this session, if it's all right with you, Minister, in the following way, that first of all, I will ask several questions, which maybe you and I could discuss. And then in the second half of the session, we'll open up for a broader discussion involving members of the audience, because I'm sure that they'll have a lot of questions to put to you. So perhaps I could start off with a fairly general question, a question about Singapore's foreign policy in quite wide terms. I think it's fair to say that Singapore has, for decades, had what you could describe as a remarkably successful foreign policy. It's encompassed relations that underpin Singapore's prosperity and Singapore's security with many countries in the region and in the wider world. Singapore seems to be a friend to all and an adversary of none, or at least very few. For example, Singapore manages to maintain close relations with both the United States and with Japan at the same time that it has very solid ties and expanding ties with the People's Republic of China. And so I suppose my first question is, how does Singapore manage this? How does Singapore manage to have positive relations with so many countries?
It's a very wide question. I suppose you could start out by talking about size, but then I see the Israeli ambassador who might disagree. Now, size matters in the sense that because we are so small, our territorial and regional interests don't come into conflict with so many countries. But I would say primarily it is due to the fact that the leadership took the world as it is, rather than taking an idealistic view of the world. So you start off with your region. Where do you live? You take the region as it is, and you learn to live with it. A very practical approach, and a clear understanding that you need regional mechanisms to try and provide a platform to resolve disputes. But fundamentally, of course, you need to be able to protect yourself. Absent that, to rely on others to protect you is not very sensible, doesn't often work. But as long as you're able to protect yourself, then you set up regional mechanisms, or you take part in regional mechanisms to try and resolve disputes, provide platforms. And ASEAN is obviously the prime example. Often I hear criticisms and arguments about ASEAN, but absent ASEAN, we would be in far worse position. So we're one of the founding members, together with 4 others, and that has now grown to a much larger organization, which is providing the platform for far bigger powers to come and speak about issues. So within Singapore, defense is key. Once you sort that out, you're able to talk to people without having to worry about where you stand. Then regional mechanisms. And then internationally, we play quite an active role, quite disproportionate to our size in international organizations, particularly the United Nations. We have always emphasized the importance of international law. Again, because in the context where size matters a lot, we emphasize law for obvious reasons. And it's very difficult to argue against that position philosophically. Now, that's only, of course, one side of the coin. The other is for people to take you seriously, you need to be successful. If we are a barren piece of rock or an island 720 square kilometers off the southern coast of Peninsular Malaysia, you and I won't be sitting here. And we won't have 200 people in this room. And we won't have as many ambassadors. So the country has to be successful economically and politically. And we have been successful economically and politically. You started out with a GDP of $500 per capita in 1965, with most people writing off this place as a country. It's an artificial country. Today it's US $65,000. Each time people said we will fail, we proved them wrong. So to be taken seriously outside, you need to be successful inside. Third, there was a certain practicality also in the approach of the leadership in how it structured the relationship with the United States, with China, with Japan. We refused to be drawn into alliances with anyone. We made it clear that we are honest, we're straight, we say exactly what we mean to all, and we can play a useful role because of the quality of the leadership and how they were able to interact with international leaders. None of these factors, none of the factors that I've outlined are either constant or a given. They're dynamic and they can change.
Thank you very much, Minister. You mentioned the question of relations with the big powers there, and looking at the big picture in the Asia-Pacific region, I think it's fair to say that developments over the last 2 or 3 years have really not been encouraging. The major powers seem to be becoming more assertive in this region. We've seen, as China's power has grown, we've seen China becoming more assertive in relation to its territorial claims in the East China Sea, but also closer to Singapore in the South China Sea. We've seen Japan under Prime Minister Abe over the last year or two adopting a more assertive foreign policy. We've seen the United States rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific region. Some would say that the regional security environment is becoming more tense and is even deteriorating, and that a regional arms race is underway. How is Singapore trying to protect its interests in this increasingly difficult regional environment?
You know, I'll make a couple of observations before I answer your question. Talk about the region becoming increasingly tense. If you go back to the late 60s, you had communist insurgencies across most of Southeast Asian countries. You had the Vietnam War. Korean War had ended 10, 15 years before that. If you looked at the countries in Southeast Asia, whether it's Thailand or Malaysia or Singapore or the others, both in terms of human development, in terms of the basic ability to deliver goods and services to people, it was a very different stage. And you had the Cold War in full swing, late 60s, early 70s. Are the circumstances today worse than then, at that time? And second, which region in the world today does not have problems? The reason I'm saying these things, I mean, take the Middle East, take Europe, different types of problems, but to be practical means to accept the world as it is and to accept that conflict and tension is an essential part of human existence. That's so, as long as you have nation states, you have conflicting interests, you have countries of different sizes at different stages of development, you are going to have conflict. So the idea of end of history was premature then and premature now. So you start with the proposition that it will be a difficult, dangerous world in most parts, and then you deal with it. On that basis, if you look at the way to analyze this is to ask yourself, what are the interests of the different countries involved? If you take the United States, it has an alliance with Japan, Australia, South Korea. It has deep economic interests in many parts of Asia. Its companies are all over. It is both a Pacific power and an Atlantic power. And America recognizes that the growth in this region, their own National Intelligence Agency estimates that 40% of the GDP of the world in the next 10, 15 years is going to be weighted in the Asia-Pacific region. So they recognize that. With so much interest in the region, is America going to walk away? Most unlikely. It will be here because its interests are here. If you take China, with a $7 trillion economy growing very quickly on a PPP basis, probably due to overtake the United States within a period shorter than what most people think, and a military and that's growing fast as well. China has huge amount of interest, obviously, both in mainland Southeast Asia and as well as in the broader Asian region. But particularly Southeast Asia, China considers its backyard, and it has some issues vis-a-vis Japan, going back to history, which, at least to the Second World War, which haven't been fully settled. And what are China's interests? First, you have to look at the domestic issues that China faces. It's got a rapidly aging population. China will become old before it becomes rich. The number of people getting into the labor force is already declining. You have vast gaps in wealth, both between the coastal regions and the internal regions, and between the urban centers and the rural centers. You have a massive task of restructuring society to reduce some of the inequities, some of the practices which mean that not all resources are used in the way they should be used. Issue of corruption has been talked about by the president as a cancer that could destroy the Communist Party. How do you do all of this while the Communist Party with its 80, 90 million cadres is above or is trying to develop an idea of rule of law in the way that you and I will understand it? They recognize the need. It's a massive challenge, and the internal challenges are huge. And China doesn't really need, and Chinese leaders really don't want any trouble outside. Because the legitimacy of the leadership is going to depend on how they can deliver social and economic progress, which is not going to be easy. If you look at Japan, there is impetus, I think, to correct what the Prime Minister sees as accidents of history and make Japan a more normal country, coupled with the internal social issues that Japan faces that most of us are aware of, including a falling birth rate, falling population, aging society, but with a huge amount of economic interest in the region. So all three of these major powers have very substantive interests in the region. We start from that, and therefore, if they don't sort it out, there will be trouble, because no one is going to walk away. China has talked about a new model of great power relationships. Not quite clear what it is, but if you go back to the recent CICA conference, China talked about Asia for Asians, which suggests that therefore non-Asians should be out of Asia. I'm not sure that that is actually going to happen in very stark terms. But I think China and the US will not want trouble with each other because they are mutually dependent on each other. So they'll have to work out a modus vivendi. The current norms of international law, rules, were developed at a time when China was weak. China is developing its power, may not necessarily agree with all those norms. The question is, how would the changing of, what norms would be changed? How would the changing of norms be done? How would China push the change? How would the US, Japan, other countries accommodate China? I can't give you answers, but I think nobody wants serious trouble. But the politics and the nationalist sentiment in each of these countries, China, Japan, US, it's everywhere, but I'm just mentioning these three, is such that what is rational in international terms to do a deal, to structure, to give and take, may not always be doable within the framework or context of local domestic political opinion. Anything that any Chinese leader does would be questioned by 500 million people on the net. So no Chinese leader can afford to be seen to be giving up on any claim. In fact, he's got to be seen to be assertive. Likewise in the US and likewise in Japan. So that is unfortunately a dynamic that can lead to some degree of irrationality on any one or two or all three of the parties. But within that framework, I think all three understand what is necessary. None of them wants trouble. But international relations are not always dictated by logic and rationality.
Thank you very much, Minister. Just to focus a little bit more on one specific aspect of the regional environment on the South China Sea. We have seen over the last 2 or 3 years China being much more assertive on its territorial claims and in terms of its activities in the South China Sea, which has brought tensions with some of the other claimants, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines. The view of Southeast Asian states is that international law should be paramount in dealing with contending claims in the South China Sea. That doesn't seem to be China's view. I wonder how do you think it is possible to reconcile China's view of the South China Sea, where it emphasizes the historical significance and basis for its claims, with the Southeast Asian states' view and the ASEAN view, which emphasizes the importance of international law and particularly UNCLOS?
I would say the assumptions behind your question are slightly biased against China. Not quite fair or accurate. Let me explain. I mean, you are posing China's position and contrasting it with an ASEAN position which you say supports international law. By implication, China is not following international law. I think that's perhaps not the most accurate, even on the facts. And unfortunately, the international media tends to be slightly anti-China, and you don't get the full facts. I don't hold a brief for China, neither do I hold a brief for any of the others. We are completely neutral. But these are the facts. China claims various islands. UNCLOS doesn't deal with ownership of islands. That depends on a variety of factors under international law, including historical title. So it's not as if a historical claim can be laughed away. Whether you have a good historical claim is a separate matter. What UNCLOS does is, if you own a piece of territory, either a coastline or an island, what territorial waters, economic zone are you entitled to based on the claim on the terra firma? So China claims various islands, in fact, a very large number of islands. The various other claimant states also make claims to islands. So there are conflicting claims. And obviously, those conflicting claims leads to conflicting claims over the waters. China has taken a number of steps to assert its claims over the waters. And China, if you ask the Chinese, they will say, for all these years, others have been drilling in areas which are clearly disputed, in waters which are associated with islands which are themselves disputed. But when China does it, there is a big hue and a cry. And that will be the Chinese position. If you ask the others, they will say these are indisputably ours. And if you ask China, China will say these are indisputably ours. So the reality is there is a dispute. And none of the countries can walk away and give up a claim on the dispute. Let's look at the latest one where China put in this huge oil rig, $1 billion oil rig near Triton Island, part of the Paracels. What you get in the international media is very different from the facts. In the international media, there is a big bully which has come in, which has put its oil rig and is doing all these things. If you go back in history, in 1958, China made a declaration that these islands belong to it and what are the waters associated with the islands that it claims. The reason China did that is because in the context of the Vietnam War, it wanted to let the Americans know what waters China was claiming. Okay? Leave aside whether China is entitled to make a claim, they made the declaration. Vietnamese Prime Minister, North Vietnamese Prime Minister, made an announcement where he said, we accept China's claim. China says, you see, North Vietnam has agreed. Vietnam's position today is a little bit more nuanced. It says, well, first of all, North Vietnam did not control those islands, so it can't have given away what it not owned. Sounds a little bit like a lawyer's argument. Second, anyway, at that stage, the Vietnam War was going on. We were dependent on China. Do you really expect us to argue? Which I don't think cuts much ice in international law. Third, more seriously, they say, well, if you look carefully, what my prime minister said was not that we accepted China's claims, but we accepted certain parts of the statement. I think those are matters of argument. But if you notice, I'm not saying Vietnam is right or China is right, but if you look carefully, the dispute is a little bit more nuanced than the way it has been portrayed in international media, and which then gives the background to the way you have phrased your questions. On the other hand, China has not helped itself in a couple of ways. First, there is a lot of doubt as to exactly what is the nature of China's claim. If it is the islands and the waters associated with the islands in accordance with international law, I think very few people will have an argument philosophically with a type of claim being made, i.e. that the law recognizes that you could make such a claim. Whether you indeed are entitled to it is a separate matter. Where China hasn't helped itself is the claims have not been very clear. It's not clear whether by drawing these 9 lines, it's claiming all the waters within the 9 lines, which means a claim to the high seas, or is it only claiming all the islands within those 9 dashed lines and the waters associated with those islands. And as long as there is a lack of clarity there, I think China opens itself up for a lot of questions. Second, and this is where ASEAN comes in, from the Singapore perspective or a non-claimant perspective, it doesn't matter who owns which islands, but where there are disputes, we want it to be dealt with in a way that doesn't lead to ships confronting each other, shots being fired, it coming to increasing kinetic conflict. And the actions on all sides have increased rather than decreased tension. No one party, I think, is responsible. And in terms of looking at international law, my sense is there are a number of parties whose actions are not in strict conformity with international law. It's not only one actor which has acted inconsistent. So really everyone should obey international law, but that sounds more like an expression of hope. And I started out by saying that we are very practical people. But second, we need to move to a situation where people start clarifying their claims. But here again, Chinese leadership is in a difficult position, as well as the leadership in Vietnam and Malaysia and Philippines, because none of the countries would be allowed to clarify their claims or make their claims or give up in a way that will require them to give up any part of their claims. That is part of the problem today. We managed all these issues very successfully by leaving them aside. Now, all the stuff is out there, and it's a potential for tension.
Given what you say, Minister, it seems that it's very important for the foreseeable future to find a way of managing these tensions in the South China Sea.
That is the best that can be hoped.
Yeah, and there's been I think there's a pretty strong consensus within ASEAN that a code of conduct governing the behavior of the various parties in the South China Sea would be extremely desirable, and there's been a lot of impetus over the last year or so to push agreement on a code of conduct, and I think the ball is in China's court at the moment. Some have said that China is not that keen on a code of conduct and is tending to delay the formulation of a workable code of conduct, and has been talking a lot about the DOC rather than the COC. Do you see much sign of real interest on China's part in a workable code of conduct?
Again, the presumption in your question is there's one party which is clearly wrong. I'm a lawyer, so I'm used to these sorts of questions and analyzing the factual assumptions behind questions which are usually inaccurate. But so I don't agree with that assumption. The reality is, I said, China is becoming a big boy at a time when the international rules and norms have been set. A larger philosophical question is really, which I alluded to earlier, is to the extent to which China would be prepared to accept the current rules of international law and international norms, which in their view were developed by states, primarily Western states, Europe and the United States, at a time when China was weak. Inevitably, there will be a challenge to those norms, because they will say we were not party to the development of these norms. We don't accept these norms, or we don't accept all of them. I think the extent to which they want to change the norms, which norms do they want to change, the extent to which others will agree to it, these are areas that are going to be quite interesting. From our perspective, many of these norms, if you take UNCLOS, for example, was developed really with the interests of the large coastal states, which will benefit. So it's actually in China's interest. And that's a point we have made to China. Coming back to COC, the best that I think we can hope for, I don't see these disputes being resolved in our lifetimes. The best that I think we can hope for is try and manage conflict and make sure that some common sense prevails. And that's why you have the DOC, and we are trying to work on the COC. Both China as well as ASEAN have publicly professed that they are keen on the COC. Rationality would suggest that we should proceed with it. There are going to be difficulties, because China says the COC has got to keep to the spirit of the DOC. And the DOC requires various types of conduct, and some countries are in breach of the DOC. And if you can't even keep to what you have already agreed, why should I agree to something new when I don't know that you will keep to the spirit of the DOC? But that, other countries then accuse China of breaching the DOC. So if we get into these accusations and counter-accusations, we'll never get to the COC. But we have made some progress in getting the COC on an official track. I've never thought it's going to be easy, partly because if you take all the complexities and you take the fact that China is growing and will inevitably, the power balance between China and the rest of the world, certainly the rest of Southeast Asia, it will keep changing, and it will keep changing to the benefit of China. And large countries, and China is not unique in this context, generally do not like to be bound by rules because they are large. The United States doesn't sign up to the International Criminal Court. It says, why should my soldiers be subjected to somebody else's law? The United States hasn't signed to UNCLOS. US had its own doctrine about what it would do to secure the peace in areas that it considered to be vital, particularly its own backyard. You had a variety of doctrines. China looks at all of that and says, the US could do all these things. Why am I being singled out? So you've got to accept large countries have different patterns of behavior, and you've got to work with that.
Thank you very much. just to shift the focus of our discussion a little bit closer to Singapore's immediate region, I think one feature of Singapore's foreign policy environment in recent years has been the general stability of its relations with its two immediate neighbors, Indonesia and Malaysia, under the SBY administration in Indonesia and under Najib's leadership in Malaysia. Such stability has not always been the case, and even this year we've seen some ripples, you might say, in Singapore's relations with Indonesia. How do you see the prospects for continuing stable and productive relations with Singapore's immediate neighbors, north and south?
On the whole, positive. Malaysia is, Malaysia and Indonesia both are blessed with huge amount of natural resources and high quality human resource. And they are reaching that stage. Malaysia certainly is further up the curve, reaching the stage where they probably, with the right sort of framework, rules, they can make a leap to the next level. Indonesia will take a bit longer, but they are both on that path. And if both our neighbors do well, that's going to be good for us. Any small country that is next to large countries which are doing well would do exceptionally well, because we are much more flexible. We are, the regional financial center. We are the services center. Our population is highly qualified. And the economy within Singapore is simply not big enough for us to support our young people's aspirations. It has to be the region. And there ASEAN comes in. If Thailand does well, Indonesia does well, Malaysia does well, and if you have an ASEAN which is more integrated, where goods, services flow more seamlessly, where you have companies in different parts of ASEAN doing business with each other, and you have people-to-people connectivity, air services, the tremendous potential of greater connectivity and integration within ASEAN cannot be underestimated. And Singapore is in a unique position to benefit from that. Every country will benefit. We will benefit differently because of our small size. I see the long-term trajectory in that context as the secular trend to be positive. There will be ups and downs, but there are, it's come down to a runoff between two candidates in Indonesia. Both have put forward or have espoused policies that are slightly more nationalistic in economic terms than the current president. It is understandable. Politics means that you've got to assure your people that your primary interest is taking care of them. So that's understandable, and maybe the economic policies may well become slightly more nationalistic. But at the same time, in today's world, for a country to succeed, it has to be connected to the world. And I think Indonesia's leadership over the years has recognized that. It plays a leading role in ASEAN in political strategic terms. It recognizes that it needs to trade, it needs to get inward investment and export to provide jobs to 240 million people. Malaysia has recognized that for some time. Malaysia is in talks on the TPP. What can happen in 3 months, 6 months, some unforeseen event, incident, I can't predict. But the longer-term secular trend, I think, gives some room for cautious optimism.
Thank you very much. Well, I think now is the time for members of our audience to pose their own questions to the Minister. Could I ask that if you do have a question, you raise your hand. Once I've recognized you, the microphone will come to you, so please stay in your seat. And if you, before asking your question of the Minister, if you could say who you are and what your affiliation is, I'd appreciate that a lot. And also, if you could please ask your question as concisely and as pointedly as you can. Sir.
Good morning. My name is Ojesia. I am from Alpha and Omega Consultants in Singapore. Your Excellency, you dwelt rather extensively on 3 countries, China.
You're going to say I didn't talk about India.
Well, probably so. I think it's an assumption from your side.
Yes.
Okay, yes. So China, Japan, and United States for various historical reasons. And you also stated you have a neutral policy to all these countries. I'm kind of reminded of the non-alignment policy of India when you mentioned neutral policy. However, in the 1980s and 90s, the ASEAN countries used to be called NICs, or newly industrious countries, and the tigers. Now that we have been talking a lot about neighbors towards the north, south, east, and west, I'd like to ask you whether another neighbor we have, which is India, is going to play a major role, a part in your international relations strategies, and especially in view of the fact that in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, these countries were like tigers, and India was not even a tiger, it was just an elephant. And in the 1990s, probably the elephant started dancing. Now that elephant is awakened, it is dancing more vigorously, and whether this dance of the elephant and tigers can be an orchestra, where the Singapore plays a good role. And in what respect or what perspective can Singapore be a pivot for that?
It's a big question. I think, there is a book by Sunil Kulkarni on the idea of India. It is a wonderful idea, but India is engaged in an experiment that very few countries have in the past succeeded in. In fact, I know of no successful country that has taken a similar experiment in political system. Let me explain. If you look at how democracy developed and universal franchise developed, let's take UK and US. I mean, today we are told mother of parliaments, universal franchise, this is where democracy developed and so on. But how did it develop? When you started out in the UK, less than 1% of the population had the franchise and the vote. The truth about both US and UK, and in fact almost the entire Western world, is that economic development preceded political development and universal franchise. And those in power, for example, if you take the 2 major parties in the US, through the 18th and 19th centuries, basically came from the same class. White, landowning, wealthy, middle class. Values were similar. There was political stability. One or the other took over. They fought hard. They had some differences of opinion, but by and large, there was stability. If you take UK, I think even as of the early 20th century, I'm not sure, but it's not more than 12% of the population, I think, which had the vote. And women didn't have the franchise until, a little bit later. In fact, the US had universal franchise only in the 1960s. Singapore had universal franchise before the US. What India has done is that with a very low economic base, in the 1947 independence, it gave universal franchise, one man, one vote to everyone. So political development and universal franchise preceded the basic economic development. And India has struggled with that. I think on the whole, the very fact that India has managed to survive and do as well as it has is a testimony to the Indian spirit. But it is an experiment that I have not seen happen anywhere else successfully. So India has succeeded against the odds. I mean, that's the way I will put it. If you look at the Asian tigers, leave Singapore out, but none of the others really had a democracy in the sense of the Western word. It all had political stability, and they were lucky to have leaders who looked at economic development over a long period of time and developed the countries. We had elections and universal franchise, but we also managed to have political stability for a long period of time until the economy reached a certain level. So I wanted to put that in context because the Indian experiment is an interesting one, and it is unique, and it has never been tried in this way anywhere, and it has never been tried in such scale. Second, when you talk about India, by the way, I'm flying off this evening to India. At 5 o'clock, I'm taking the flight. India we talk about it as one country, but you go from Delhi to Chennai to Hyderabad to Bangalore, back to, Patna, you are in different countries, different cultures, different languages. You are the Prime Minister in the center, if he gives a directive, the Chief Minister in Chennai may or may not agree. She's from a different party anyway. And she doesn't owe her position or power or allegiance to him. She depends on the voters in Tamil Nadu to re-elect her. So it's a very, in that sense, decentralized. So you got to understand the limitations of power in Delhi within a large democracy with so many languages, so many really different countries put together. And the very fact that the country has survived as a unitary state in such a way and has progressed as much as it has and is looking at a new dawn again is actually quite amazing. I agree with you that there is a lot of optimism and hope. Between India and Singapore, we have always had excellent relationships. And we think that there is scope to do a lot more. But the Indian government's priorities must be, and they seem to be, and my sense of that is confirmed by what I read, is really the upliftment of the ordinary Indian and economic development. The country cannot become very powerful externally until and unless it gets its house in order internally. And there is a lot to be done internally in terms of education, in terms of female empowerment, in terms of basic primary health care. I mean, some of the statistics about India, and on the one hand, this is a country that sends people, rockets, rocket technology, physics and maths and computer science. On the other hand, infant mortality is higher than sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a lot for the government to do. And my sense is the priorities of the government are focused on the internal development of India. Now, inevitably, there will be external interactions. And as with all countries, the focus will be on where the issues are greatest, which means India will probably be focused on the Northwest first, dealing with, putting its relationship with Pakistan on a good footing, dealing with the issue in Afghanistan. I'm sure Southeast Asia and East Asia would figure in the Indian calculus, but in order of priority, I suspect it's not going to be the highest priority and must be necessarily so. But in economic relationships, because India's priorities dovetail with the strengths and the priorities of various Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore. For example, the Prime Minister has talked about 100 smart cities, urban solutions. Those are all areas we're strong on. We see a lot of scope for partnership with India. But for us, whoever is in the center, whoever is in the state, we deal with the country and we deal with the states. And we don't take sides on the internal politics. Each government comes, there are a set of policies, and we work with them. Yeah. It's up to the chairman.
One quick follow-up, sir.
You mentioned Singapore was one of the founding fathers of ASEAN, and now from 4 to 5 to come to 10, or 9 or 10. Is India one of the countries that you look into to incorporate into ASEAN countries or region?
I think that you would have to do a little bit of geographical gymnastics to include India as a member of ASEAN. India is a dialogue partner of ASEAN. and a strong dialogue partner. And our hope and wish is that that dialogue partnership can be developed more substantially.
Next question from the gentleman at the front here.
Thank you very much. My name is Yoshioka from NHK TV. Allow me to go a little bit specific in an issue you have raised in previous conversation, that the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is now trying to change the interpretation of the Japanese Constitution in order to exercise the right of collective self-defense. At the earliest, I think they will announce it tomorrow, I think. So in Asia, some countries welcome this new action and others are not. So please, would you let us know your opinion over what kind of influence would this action bring to the security environment in Asia Pacific, and what is the Singapore's position over it? Thank you.
Can you repeat the last part of the question? I got the Singapore's position, but before that, what did you say?
Yes, I would like to know what kind of influence would this action bring to the security environment of Asia Pacific region?
I think, what the Japanese Prime Minister is doing, and I alluded to this in my earlier remarks, is to make Japan a more normal country. The reactions to that obviously have been a little mixed. Some countries have welcomed it, but in the countries where the historical memories of World War II are very strong, there has been a degree of unhappiness, not necessarily with the idea of a greater collective security or defense posture by Japan, but also by what seems to be understood as Japan's, or the questions raised by some Japanese leaders about the facts of what happened on the ground in Korea, in China. And that questioning, I think, has unnecessarily clouded what legitimate aspirations Japan may have in terms of its economic and security profile. One is purely emotional. What happened in Korea, what happened in China, what happened in the rest of Asia? Who is responsible? To what extent is there culpability? Did it happen? And when questions are raised as to whether any of this happened, you've seen the reaction in Korea, who are allies with the US, who are also your allies. And as my Prime Minister has said more than once, we in Singapore have moved on from our Second World War past. We have drawn a line and decided for very, sensible reasons to forge a new relationship with Japan, which we did from the 60s and 70s. And Japan is a very close economic, strategic partner for Singapore. But other countries haven't done that, and Japan hasn't quite squared its accounts, historical accounts, with those countries. And I think that continues to be an emotional block, and Japanese actions then continue to be perceived through that prism. That's one issue. You see, and also often there are words, and then the next question is what's meant by the words. Who can argue about a greater self-defense capability or greater contribution to collective security? Everyone will welcome it in principle, but what China understands by those terms when used by Japan are different from what Japan understands by those terms when Japan uses those terms, and that's part of the problem. I think we believe that Japan, as the third largest economy in the world, with significant interests in the region, will inevitably want to play a bigger role. And we believe that Japanese aspirations in that context need to be accommodated within a framework. But Japan-China relations, the two countries will and should try and sort it out, because the most important relationship is between Washington and Beijing. If there is trouble there, there is trouble for the rest of us. The second most important relationship is between Tokyo and Beijing. If there is trouble there, there is trouble for all of us. That's why there needs to be a framework that accommodates the legitimate interests and aspirations of China, Japan, and the United States in this region.
Thank you. Sir.
My name is Alban Kang. I'm a practicing Singapore lawyer. Minister, sir, my question relates to the ASEAN Economic Community, which is scheduled to kickstart next year. How do you see the impact of AEC on Singapore? And do you see the AEC becoming an ASEAN version of the European community with free movement of goods, not only goods and services, but people? And would that lead to some form of harmonization of laws in the ASEAN countries?
I'm a great believer in Europe, and I'm on record as saying that the people who talk about the demise of Europe, and last year and the year before I've said this on record in public, people who believe in the demise of Europe or the European Union really don't know what they're talking about, because there are a few other centers of excellence with such deep reservoirs of talent, capital, knowledge, and history and culture, right? But at the same time, I think even the Europeans will agree that the precise EU model may not be the ultimate for us to follow right now. Again, one word of mine that I'll keep using, you've got to be practical about it. If you take Europe, you have countries with broadly similar histories, and they've been fighting with each other for so many centuries. This project started in the 20th century after the Second World War. Similar religion, similar culture, shared history, and you had all of that to start the European project. And even then, it has taken quite some time and a lot of effort and a lot of money and a lot of hand-wringing right now, but I'm sure it will do well. They're already getting out of the crisis. But if you look at ASEAN, the vast differences in economic development, for a start. You take Singapore and you take a country like Cambodia, they're at very different levels. Culture is also very different. The geography is quite different. Religions are different. So, given such vast differences, to think in terms of a project similar to the European project at this point in time is very unrealistic. What you can do is we have a set of common, shared, mutual goals in security, in economics. And we have a shared goal in increasing the people-to-people movement. So work with that. Try and create a community that increases people-to-people connectivity, that puts across rails, roads, ports, airports, and brings people together. It's already beginning to happen. That allows a freer movement of goods across the country. Services, a little bit more difficult. For example, I'm sure the bar in Singapore will be less than happy if I said all lawyers from the entire region. I don't know whether you will support it. You can tell me. But, you talk about it, you've got to put your money where your mouth is also. So likewise, I'm sure lawyers in KL and lawyers in Bangkok will have different viewpoints. So we got to move at a realistic pace on services. On tariffs, we are about 85-86% of the way down. The next year, more will come down. By 2015, we will have reached at a decent place. It doesn't stop there. It will have to continue. So you let the facts on the ground speak for themselves and let integration take place. Let the business logic drive, business and social logic drive this. But in terms of political systems, I think we are still quite far away from having a single ASEAN government. The values and the approaches are quite different. How does Singapore stand to benefit from it? If you look at Asia today, leave out India, China, Japan, which is the most important financial center? Which is the center of excellence for law, accounting, banking, other services? Which place has the best logistics? You can fly in, fly out. Which place is the safest? There's only one place. And that place can serve as an intellectual, financial place, center for ASEAN. But that's only possible if the rest of ASEAN does well. If there is no business to be done, there's nothing to be done here either. So if they all do well, we do well. And ASEAN 2015 and the project of ASEAN Common Community is part of that picture.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for, if it's all right with you, Minister, if we're running over a little bit, but I think we have time for one or two more questions. Mr. Soria.
So Singapore has got asymmetric but excellent relations between Singapore and China on one side and Singapore and India on the other side. What is Singapore's perspective on China-India relations? One is interested to know about that. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I have a unique perspective on China-India relations. I noted with interest that the Chinese foreign minister was one of the first to visit Delhi after the new government was sworn in. We are also fairly early in terms of going. I'm going today and meeting officials and the Prime Minister tomorrow and day after. But China was much earlier. And I think that's indicative of a desire both on the part of Delhi and Beijing to structure a relationship. They know that they have to get along. Again, I think both don't need the distraction of a major dispute. And economically, there is much that they need to discuss. There is a lot of potential. It will be cooperative, but I'm sure it will be competitive. Both know that. And I think my sense is they are trying to work out something that's workable for both. China would be concerned that India should not be drawn into any sort of loose coalition or alliance of countries to form against China. It's never been an Indian approach to be part of any such major alliances, but these are interesting times.
Thank you. And for our final question from the audience, gentleman on the left at the front.
Thank you. Francesco Mancini from IPI. I wanted to draw you out of the region and ask you a more global question. Many are pointing toward the Middle East in flame, a more assertive Russia, the UN incapable of delivering global public goods. What is your overall analysis of the state of global affairs? Are you a pessimist or an optimist? Thank you.
Am I optimistic about the world? I think, I take the world as it is. I think there will always be trouble. And the US today, for a number of reasons, is less able to impose world order than it used to be. It needs to be a more cooperative effort between the US and several other major powers. Some are willing, some are unwilling to be co-opted into a current system which is dominated by rules put forward by the US. I'm broadly optimistic that eventually we will move towards a system where a new equilibrium, new dynamic would be structured. Don't get me wrong, there will always be problems, there will be wars, there will be tensions, there will be trouble everywhere. But I think we will muddle along, mainly because if you look at Africa, it's now a positive story. Differing pictures, but on the whole, you're looking at growth rates of somewhere between 6 to 8%, maybe higher in some places. If you look at South America, the importance of rule of law and structures and transparency is beginning to be accepted, and it's another area of growth. These were all not significant areas of growth, say 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Europe is coming out of its economic malaise. There will be some trouble, but on the whole, it's beginning to show positive momentum. The US is also beginning to show, despite the latest figures, broadly positive trajectory. And the US is helped, I've said this a number of times, by the fact that its energy costs are going to be much lower than the costs anywhere in this region. The huge advantage that countries in this region had in terms of labor costs is now going to be reduced or perhaps erased by the fact that a large amount of US manufacturing could potentially be done automatically through 3D printing and so on. So it cuts into the advantage of labor that low-cost countries have. So US is an area of optimism. Japan's policies, jury is out, but it is generally more likely than not that the Japanese will succeed. China, people put a question mark on its economic policies and the slowing down of growth. But on the whole, given how competent the Chinese are in managing their economy and the vast reserves that China has to tide over problems, on the whole, I'm more optimistic than pessimistic about China. So economically, the picture is one of, I think one can be cautiously optimistic. And if there is a broadly positive economic picture, albeit slow growth, then there is interest on the part of the countries to try and avoid trouble. And Russia's actions in some places have raised eyebrows. We have issued statements. But on the whole, I think in international terms, Russia has seen, in some places it has seen fit to go along with the international flow of events. In some places it has stood against them. But I'm not sure that its ability to disrupt this large picture is going to be that significant. And India has just started with a new government. It's not so much new government or world government, but a government with a strong mandate, which is important, and gives it at least the basic parliamentary tools to push through legislation. And our own ASEAN project is, and I keep telling people, don't forget, people think in terms of China and India in Asia, but Singapore's economy today is actually larger than ASEAN's economy is larger than India's economy. So you have actually 4 major centers in Asia: Japan, China, ASEAN, India. And all 4, there's some room for being optimistic about. So on the whole, despite all the troubles, I'm more optimistic than pessimistic.
Minister, thank you very much for your excellent answers to these good questions. And I'm particularly struck by your upbeat answer to that last question, that despite an expectation that there are always going to be troubles.
I did say probably cautiously optimistic.
You are quite optimistic. You are, on balance, optimistic. Maybe just to round off the session, I could ask you just one last question, and that's about the making of Singapore's foreign policy. I wonder if you could just say a few things about the process by which Singapore's foreign policy is made. To what extent does Singapore's foreign policy result from the work of diplomats in the MFA? How does MFA coordinate with other ministries such as MTI and MINDEF? What are the other influences on foreign policy making? How important are discussions with your cabinet colleagues on foreign policy?
Again, I go back to the point about size. You know, we are too small a place to not realize that an impact in one area impacts on all areas. For example, a relationship with, say, Malaysia or Indonesia or US or China. Take China, for example. 2013, we were the largest investor in China. Big number. 2013, we were also, I think, the second largest investor from Asia into the United States, if I've gotten my figures right. Do we have significant interest in both countries, economic? Obviously, yes. If something goes in our relationship with either of them, would that have an economic impact? Yes. Would that have a strategic impact? Yes. So how do you divide between MTI, MFA, MINDEF? They are all interlinked. It's too small a place for it not to be interlinked and for us not to recognize it. We have been lucky because we have been fortunate enough to have a civil service as well as a foreign service that's highly professional. Not by accident. You know, the system went out to choose the very best people, bring them in, send them overseas, scholarships. They get in. You could argue whether it has the same vigor and entrepreneurship as, for example, it had when there were far less people and there were less rules, and you were in a startup environment in the 60s and 70s. Today, it is more of a developed country environment where you come in, there's a large organization, whichever ministry you go to, there are set rules, and there are, you know, hierarchies. But on the whole, I think one of the areas where Singapore would be identified as being successful is in the delivery of, in governance and the delivery of public services. Ups and downs, but on the whole, that's, I think, a fair assessment. That comes about because it's a small place, quite cohesive, and at the political level, at the cabinet level, all the issues are discussed, including all foreign policy issues. The key ministries would be, or key ministers involved in the ministries which have a stake in foreign policy would be actively involved in thinking through our positions. Positions which are developed through experience, knowledge by the foreign policy professionals in the ministry. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Minister, for answering all our questions so thoughtfully, fully, and so candidly. I'm sorry that I must bring this morning's IISS Fullerton lecture to a close, but before doing that, I'd like to thank Mr. Shanmugam for making time in his schedule to honor us by agreeing to have this conversation here in the ballroom of the Fullerton Hotel this morning. Minister, you've cast light on some very important aspects of Singapore's foreign policy, both in Singapore's own region and more widely in the Asia-Pacific and throughout the world. And you've touched on economic as well as security aspects. I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say that we're all very grateful to you for spending time with us to start off the week this morning. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you.